education is older than schooling. Long before we had schools, universities, and colleges, human beings were passing on their knowledge and understanding to their children, but they were doing it almost incidentally as they went through their daily lives. For pre-industrial people almost everywhere in the world, education wasn't a preparation for life, it was a part of life. That ancient and powerful style of education still exists, and that's the lifetime preoccupation of Dr. Gregory Cajete. A Tewa Indian from the Pueblos of New Mexico, Greg Cajete has spent his life striving to harmonize indigenous ways of learning and knowing with Western science and scholarship, so that each tradition can be enriched by the other. Where Western scholarship tends to isolate things in order to understand them rationally, Native thinking perceives objects and events holistically and spiritually in terms of their relationships with their surroundings. For Greg Cajete, the two modes of knowing are complementary. Together, they offer a depth of understanding that neither can provide on its own, a depth of understanding that we desperately need as we confront a crisis brought on, perhaps, by an explosion of knowledge and a shortage of wisdom. Dr. Gregory Cajete. As I was sort of preparing the notes for this, I thought to myself, from a Native viewpoint, I suspect we're already in sort of alien territory because we're splitting off the environment as if it were a separate thing. And that's not really the Native view of it, is it?
Not really. In terms of indigenous thought, human beings and plants and animal and place are all one entity, expression of the same life force, if you will. And so in most indigenous epistemologies, you have a recognition that human beings are a part of the natural world and are intimately intertwined with all of its processes. So hence there's a sense for a kind of reciprocal, mutual responsibility for how you work and how you act and how you think in regard to the natural world. So yeah, it's always an integration versus a dichotomy.
Yeah, and it seems to me this has got to be for someone like yourself, who's raised very much in the indigenous tradition, but it's now very much in a
Right.
Western context. You must have the two sides of your brain kind of fighting it out from time to time.
I always wonder about that because I'm wondering how I've been able to somehow manage to integrate the two worlds. And I think part of that has to do with maybe ways that I was conditioned in my early days growing up in Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, in terms of interacting with lots of different kinds of people, but always remembering and always having a sense of my home and my community as being the place where I belonged, but also having, I think, the confidence to go out and to meet other people and to interact with other cultures and other traditions that are also part of the New Mexico landscape. Yeah, so.
Now tell me a little bit more about the Native worldview, I guess, because one of the things that I was interested in your book was that it not only extended across physical objects and other forms of life and so forth, but it also had an extension into the past and into the present.
Right.
Can you talk a little about that?
Well, I think, when you talk about indigenous thought, you're really talking about a continuity, almost a circle of thought that is ever evolving and ever changing and ever, it's a continuation of movement. And so in that kind of thinking, past, present, and future are connected in a kind of dynamic process. So one of the metaphors that we use in my language, which is Tewa, which is the language spoken in the northern part of New Mexico, among 6 villages that live in that area above Santa Fe, New Mexico, is this idea, this concept called look to the mountain. And sometimes when we're discussing something that's very important to us, an issue, let's say, within the context of a community situation, invariably an elder will stand up and particularly when people are, as they have been in this meeting, for instance, interacting very, very passionately. Everyone has a particular position or opinion, and there's a kind of competition of one voice over another. An elder will stand up and say, in my language, "Bimpio-obi," which means towards the mountains look. Now, in my tradition, among my people, we also venerate mountains. Mountains are sacred to us. We're in valleys, basically, and there are sacred mountains or major mountains that surround those valleys. And so the mountain is very important to us ecologically because that's the sources of our water. And we know that each mountain has its own unique personality. And that's very true ecologically as well because it has a unique ecology. But we also know that that it's for us a metaphor that represents past, present, and future in a continuity of process and interaction with the natural world. And so when the elder says Bimpio-obi, which is towards the mountains or look to the mountain, which is the name of my book, my first book, what they're saying metaphorically is whatever is before you, the situation or the problem or the issue, look at it as if you're looking at it from the perspective of a mountain. And of course, there's a process where if you're climbing a mountain, you go through the foothills and you go in the process of the winding trails to get to the top of the mountain. And then there's the presence of being on the mountain. And then there's the perspectives of the other mountains or the valleys that you see. So it's usually a 360-degree perspective. And so metaphorically, when the elder says, look to the mountain, what they're saying is consider where you have come from, which is your history, your past, your cultural tradition. Consider where you are at now, which is your present, and look at the possibilities of where you may go in the future, which is the vision of the possibilities around you that are represented graphically when you're on top of the mountain. So that idea of interacting with the natural world it takes the forms of metaphors that are spoken linguistically, represented in art forms. In some cases, those metaphors are danced or they're sung, or in other cases, ritual or ceremony are created around them to help people to remember those very, very important understandings of who you are as a people and how you are related, past, present, and future, within the context of a community that's not only the human community, but it's also inclusive of plants and animals, the mountain, the deserts, the plains that are in your place, in your homeland.
It's a perspective that's got to make you think very, very carefully about the decision that you're making, right? Because
Absolutely,
it's put in a huge context, isn't
absolutely, it? Absolutely. It's about understanding the ramifications of every decision you make, especially as they affect everyone else in the community. And it's always not just about the people; it's also about how it affects your environment, plants and animals, the guardians of the environment itself. All of those kinds of considerations come into that kind of discussion.
The guardians. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, all indigenous traditions all over the world recognize that there are energies, within the natural world that have not only a presence but also kind of personality, and that this presence, these energies, are what help make the spirit of that place work in either positive or negative ways. So we have whole conceptual frameworks that revolve around an understanding of our relationship, proper relationship to those energies, to those Some people would call them spirits, but I call them energies. And truthfully, when you take a look at it scientifically, or biologically, that's very true. Every living thing emanates an energy that, if you're sensitive enough, or you made yourself sensitive enough, you can feel that energy. And there are people who can actually work with those energies in a variety of different kinds of ways. So that's the kind of intimacy, I guess you might say, that Indigenous people over many, many generations, have developed in regard and in relationship to the places in which they live.
That's another whole dimension, isn't it? I mean, you've got the dimension of past, present, and future. You've got the dimension of your 360-degree view, where you've come from, where you're going. And then on top of it, you've got this sort of spirit dimension, spiritual dimension.
Sure. So, and metaphorically, we call that wind, water, and breath. Wind, water, and breath. So wind is your consciousness. We call consciousness or mindfulness, or your thinking process, is a kind of wind. And we're made of water, essentially, so that's in the waters of life are all around us, consistently. And then breath, of course, is what animates our human body, essentially, as a living body. So wind, water, breath, or water, wind, breath, actually is the proper sequence, water, wind, breath. It's the same thing as saying mind, body, spirit, or body, mind, spirit. Yeah, it's the same concept, but we're using those metaphors to represent that triangulation, if you will, of process. Yeah.
So let me quote back a little piece from your book in the context of this understanding that you've, I think, beautifully conveyed. The goal of Indigenous education, you said in Look to the Mountain, is to be fully knowledgeable about one's place in the universe or spirituality. This is often realized through the structures of daily practices as well as in sacred art, ceremonies, rituals, and dances, all in reflection of nature's cycles. So that's the goal of Indigenous education. Right?
Yeah, it's really about, very similar to the Buddhist concept of a rightful understanding of your place in the world. Yeah, and so that idea of Indigenous education is very much a part of what I call relationship, responsibility, and respect and resonance. So, in education we have the 3 R's. Western education, we're drummed into this. What's drummed into us is the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay, but I say there's 4 R's. Which is relationship, responsibility, respect, and resonance. So, just to give you an example, as I was writing Look to the Mountain, I was looking around for an Indigenous metaphor, because a lot of what I'm writing about in Look to the Mountain is what I'm doing is unpacking lots of Indigenous metaphor, linguistic metaphors. Look to the Mountain, the title is one of those metaphors. So I'm looking at around, and I'm attempting to find some sort of representation in a kind of succinct way of describing what Indigenous education is. So I did a lot of research, and there really are lots and lots of ways that different Indigenous people all over the world describe this process that we call education, or coming to know, coming to knowledge. And so as I was looking around, I found this kind of obscure book that was written by a man whose name is Miguel Leon Portillo, and he was a professor at the University, I think he was at the University of Texas, if I'm not believing. I may be wrong with that, but anyway, he wrote a book called Aztec Thought and Culture, and this was way back in the 1960s. And at that time, as I was writing this book, I couldn't find very many good examples at that time of Indigenous philosophy written from indigenous perspectives, and that's what I was looking for. So I found that in Miguel's book, Aztec Thought and Culture, there was this poem that had been translated from Nahuatl, which is the language spoken by the Indians in Mexico, into Spanish, and then he had translated it into English. And in that poem, there was a scene that the poem was describing, and the scene was where among the Aztecs they had colleges, what we would call colleges today, called the Calmacac, and they had two of them. They had one that was primarily for teaching philosophers and astronomers, and then the other one was a military school, basically. So they had two kinds of academies, and the Solomon, it's called the Salomonin, who would be the professor, comes before his students, and he asks them, what is it to be a person of knowledge? What is it? The question is, what is to be a person of knowledge? And the students are sent off, and he chants this to them because in the Nahuatl tradition, the education was chanted. In other words, the lectures were chanted and the students chanted back their response. So the students go off and they think about the question, what is it to be a person of knowledge? They come back a few days later and they answer it in this way, and that's what the poem describes. So the students say, chanting, say, to be a person of knowledge, one was first to find one's face. And so that's a metaphor which essentially means, you've got to know who you are. Identity is the first task of knowledge. And then one must find one's heart, which is, what are you passionate about? What is the spirit of desire, your affective self, that guides you? And then one must find one's foundation, which is, I guess the best, translation today would be vocation. That kind of work that most completely allows you to express your face and your heart, within the kind of work that you do. But they say it wasn't only about that. It wasn't only about finding face, finding heart, and foundation, but it was about finding those aspects of yourself in concentric rings of relationship of what I would call what I call responsibility or relationship, responsibility, respect, and resonance. First, yourself within yourself with your family, yourself with your extended family or your clan, yourself with your tribe, your larger group, yourself with the place in which you live, and then finally yourself with the whole cosmos. And that happens, and it doesn't end there, because it's not just about those relationships and responsibilities in those concentric rings, but it's also about becoming complete as a man or as a woman. So all of that was in that poem, that reflected in the translation that Miguel Leon Portillo had mentioned. And so when I saw that, I thought, this embodies what I consider to be the essence of what indigenous people talk about, that this is the essence of indigenous education that guides, I think, in many ways, how traditionally indigenous peoples looked at the process of coming to know yourself within all of these concentric rings of relationships, the 4 R's. And so I use that in the book and describe that this is one metaphor that really describes, in some ways, I think, the essence of indigenous education. So what I'm saying essentially is that there is a a very deep epistemology of education among Indigenous peoples. But it's not necessarily something that is written. It's more something that is lived and expressed, you know, as I said, through language, through art, through, you know, multiple kinds of ways of expression. You know?
You know, as you talk about it, I think this is very clear. You know, it's not. This is not mystical or cloudy or fuzzy around the edges. Really, really clear. It's very complex.
Yes.
And it's very profound.
Yes.
You know? And now, how do you convey that? I mean, you've told us about the Aztecs having a college, but I don't think that was necessarily the way that all Indigenous groups would have conveyed that knowledge. How would it be? What would be the other ways how would a young person figure that out in other Aboriginal cultures?
Well, yeah, I think you grow up within it. You grow up in which that kind of thinking about what it is to be a person of knowledge is implicit within the different kinds of things you do in community. And that's why my next book is really about, for lack of a better word, the pedagogy of Indigenous community, you know, teaching and learning through Indigenous community. Because that's really where this kind of coming to know oneself, finding one's face and foundation, it unfolded within the different kinds of things that happen in a young person's life within the interaction and participation of community. And again, I really emphasize that it's not only the natural, it's not only the human community, the social community, but it's interaction with all of these other natural communities that are recognized by Indigenous people in the places in which they live.
Yeah, so one of the things I thought when I first came across your work was that it was remarkable that you were able to speak with such authority about Indigenous traditions when there are so many different groups and nations and tribes and so forth.
True,
but I think you're right. From the little I know about it, it does seem as though there are these common understandings expressed in different ways.
Well, I think that's what I was looking for, because, you know, in the United States there are over 500 tribal groups, and there's over 365 languages and dialects that are spoken just in the continental United States. It's almost equivalent in Canada, and
it's almost that much in British Columbia, I think.
Yeah, just in British Columbia alone. And then certainly the same thing is true of Mexico, Central and South America. So that when you're talking about Indigenous North and South America, you know, you're really talking about, several thousand, languages, traditions, and expressions of Indigenous thought. But there are some principles, you see, that tie Indigenous people together wherever they are. And those are the principles that I try to flesh out, using, first of all, my own knowledge of my own people and their thinking and their process. A lot of this is not told to you directly. I mean, it's a process of learning it through participation, through experience, through listening to the stories that are told about, which are metaphoric, and you sort of have to think about, well, what's the moral or what's the teaching of this story? And through the practices, through the meanings behind the art forms that are produced, and the poetries that are written, the songs that are sung. And so there's multiple ways in which these principles get expressed in Indigenous contexts, and so that reflects the diversity. So in science, we have a term called, or in biology, we have a term called unity in diversity. So my first degree was in biology. And so I'm a trained scientist in that sense, in the Western sense, but I was always able to relate what I was learning in Western science, in biology, to the experiences that I had as a Native person, growing up in my community. And then later on, I realized that other Indigenous communities, while they were diverse and different in terms of their language or the expression or even the places in which they lived, but they also had the same principles that they respected and that they honored. And the same thing is true, as we're here in Bhutan. I see exactly the same kinds of understandings, at least in the traditional perspectives that the Bhutanese have about the place in which they live, about the mountains, about the water, about the spirits that guide and guard, this place. And so it's here too. And so what I'm saying is that there is a unity in Indigenous thinking, but there's also that diversity. So the unity and diversity principle works. And you see that ecologically also. In any ecological community, you see that unity and diversity principle operating and reflecting itself.
It's quite stunning, actually, when you think that you come from New Mexico, from that tradition, you arrive in Bhutan. And as you've been speaking, I've been thinking, well, this sounds very Bhutanese in many respects,
Yeah, very Buddhist too now.
Very Buddhist, yeah, doesn't it? Yeah. So if I understand you correctly about the sort of the teaching and learning, it isn't. I mean, it's interesting because what I think I am hearing you saying is that teaching and learning itself is not separated from the rest of living. It's the learning goes on and the teaching goes on,
Absolutely.
just as one's pursuing one's life, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And one specific you had mentioned was that somewhere was hunting as a way of. Tell me a bit about that, because that seems like one where you're actually attacking your brother in a way,
Well, life lives on life. And the fact that animals have to be killed to sustain human life, is a fact of life, and was a matter of survival for human beings, through the thousands of years that we've evolved in different places, in different contexts of natural contexts. So the hunting traditions, are the oldest traditions of human cultures. Fishing comes, I think, a distant second, but it's really the hunting traditions. And so human beings, wherever they were and whatever culture they were a part of, had to come to terms with the fact that they had to hunt and kill other animals, other entities, natural entities, living entities in the world in order to survive. So they came to terms with that, through ritualizing and understanding very deeply why that was and why the giving of the life of an animal, the taking of a life of an animal, was an important act for human survival, but nonetheless required great respect and great care. And so you had really, truthfully, let's say going back 40,000 years or more, 50,000 years, to the times of ancient peoples, and one of the first kinds of ritual or ceremony that evolved were the rites of hunters, before or after they came back from the hunt, to either appease what they had done with the animal kingdom, who they also considered equal to themselves, having community and having life. So you find in the caves of Lascaux in France or Tréfrière, the paintings of early hunters as they were going through their hunting rituals and representing the animals that they had killed and empathizing with those animals. So that's that hunting tradition, and through that process of learning your relationship to animals, you also learn something about certainly yourself. And so the hunting traditions are the oldest traditions, really, along with the planting traditions, or rather gathering of plants. So there's this dependence of human beings on plants and animals that you have to, an early man had to find ways to, in a sense, because of the intimate understanding that we are the animals or we are the plants and the plants are us, that we have to find ways to accommodate this relationship and to balance it. And so, that's really the ecological thought and the ecological mind, I think, really began to evolve. In those very, very early times when human beings had to think about how they were related to those plants or those animals, and feeling very badly about having to take their life, but realizing that they had to do it. But nonetheless, had to also account for that through ritual and through ceremony.
So the cave paintings become almost like a way of paying respect
Sure.
to the animal you've had to kill.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and there was also probably initiation rites, for hunters that were going to go on the hunt, or had been successful for the hunt. So, you can trace all of these, many of these thoughts, especially the ecological thinking of early hunters, to present times, and there are many traditions around the world, indigenous traditions, that still continue some of these practices. The Bushmen, for instance, in Africa, would be one example. But there are many other indigenous traditions that have similar kinds of reflective, creating a resonance as well as a relationship, deep relationship with the plants and animals that they depended on, for their life, and later on also for fish too.
Yes.
Fishing.
Yes, of course. I'm a coastal guy, so fishing comes early on for me.
Fishing was also a very important part of it.
You've painted here a picture of a world, basically with people all over it,
Yes.
all of whom have, broadly speaking, a similar understanding of their relationship to the world in which they find themselves.
Right.
And then you've got this abrupt break
Yeah.
into the world that we now have brought into a state of crisis.
Yeah.
Do you sometimes find yourself feeling as though this is all kind of unreal, that we've come to this position that we find ourselves in now? How can we have lost something as magnificent as the vision that you're telling me about?
Well, I think, what anthropology tells us is that break happened very distinctly when human beings stopped being hunting cultures and became agricultural cultures. And so the introduction of agriculture into human civilization, human society, was the beginning of that process. Now, I say that with a certain amount of, I was say it is kind of like the fall from Eden, but I think that I have to say that with a grain of salt, because I think some indigenous societies did make a more ecological transition to agriculture than others. Okay, and even in agricultural societies, you have many rights and many kinds of relationships that are still very ecological in their orientation and in their thinking.
Like fertility rates and that
Yeah. But I think that something did happen, as agriculture started to evolve in different cultures and societies, and particularly in the West, that there was a gradual distancing as a result of the agricultural life and lifestyle of human beings from an immediate direct relationship with the natural, as they had with plants and animals and in their hunting traditions. And so you can almost trace this, certainly, and there are a number of books that sort of describe this fall from Eden, that has ultimately led us to see when you're able to sort of control your food supply and actually have surplus as a result of that relationship that you had prior to maybe plants and animals, it didn't become as pronounced and as important. And gradually you begin to forget about those relationships and you begin to focus increasing your harvest, and then eventually, creating a surplus, and then finding out that you can sell that surplus or barter that surplus, for other material goods, and then you can create a whole society around producers who are the farmers, and then you have an elite, that sort of control everything, and eventually you have what is called, quote unquote, civilization, and then you get into many of the issues that we get into today.
Well, there's another whole distancing with industrialism, isn't there?
Yeah, and then the advent of industrialism, particularly, and then the ideology of capitalism, and then now the ideology of globalization. Really a continuation of that colonization of the world, essentially, for profit, and so we have, very, very definite kinds of trajectories, I guess you might say, of that thought process. See, and a lot of cultures, they did develop agriculture, but there was enough of that older ethic of relationship and responsibility and respect and resonance that they developed agriculture to a certain point, but they didn't develop it to the point where they were destroying, their natural environments to the extent that happened all of a sudden as a result of industrialization, and then and now globalization.
I sometimes think that my grandfather, who was a grain farmer in Manitoba,
Yeah.
was kind of right at the edge of that. I mean, I know that my mother talked about him as having this huge respect for the land, although
Oh, yes.
although that kind of farming was pretty destructive of the original prairie too.
Yeah. Yeah. But not as destructive as it's become now.
No, nowhere near. Of course, no
Nowhere near.
chemicals were involved. It was all
Right.
entirely natural stuff.
Right.
But you make the word control was one that's very important in your view of how we've in a sense run amok here.
Yeah. So that control, I think, I know in Buddhism they have the concept, and we were just discussing it earlier in one of the sessions here in the conference, is the concept of right to livelihood, and a care and an understanding of how you make your livelihood becomes a major value question, ethical question. And I think that the element of control, along with immediate gratification, along with the way that the world and everything that it contains, the ideology of gross national product, and looking at everything, literally everything, including human beings, as being product or potential product for some, business enterprise, becomes that problematic idea.
Or only as a consumer.
Yes, only as a consumer. Right.
Right.
So, I guess, if you were asked me what role does Indigenous, because Indigenous societies all over the world are attempting to hold on to what they have in terms of their culture, tradition, language, and especially to hold on to the lands that they have. So you have in the world today what I call the fourth world. The indigenous world is called the fourth world, and you have something like 600 million indigenous people on the earth today that live in usually remote parts of the world, which are now being accessed, for their natural resources. And so you have a real struggle, on the part of indigenous people to maintain themselves as indigenous people, with a semblance of their language, culture, and tradition at least intact. And I think as you look around today, part of the indigenous movement is really about certainly holding on to what we have, or revitalizing our language or traditions, but also hopefully making a statement that we need to really think about another way of living, and actually graphically representing that way of living, philosophically and otherwise. as one alternative that we have to begin to look at again, and hopefully reinvent in a modern society in a modern way, which I think is really what we're attempting to do with the ecological movement worldwide, so that you know, we're really in a position where we have to really begin to learn from all our past, and especially our indigenous past, to respect and to once again find our face and find our heart and find our foundation in proper relationship and responsibility and respect and resonance, you know, with the whole of the natural world. And so that's the lesson that indigenous philosophy, if you will, you know, has to offer. It's an example. But again, indigenous people themselves are working a lot of those issues out themselves within their communities. But we do have that history, you know, and I think that's the important and valuable contribution that we can make and are making, you know, in today's world.
It's a profound gift. It is. Just to go back to that issue of control, I want to quote you once more.
Sure.
But I think it's a very important quote. The modern obsession of being in control and the dream of eliminating uncertainty through control of nature, which is the underlying philosophical premise of Western science, must give way to the reality of moving creatively with the flow of events, which is the true reality of the universe.
That's true.
And you actually see Western science now moving in that direction too, so you see a sort of convergence.
I see some aspects of Western science moving. It's still, in terms of the applied science, it's still very Newtonian in its orientation, which simply means that it still looks at the world as this mechanical machine, you know, that it can control. But I think we're beginning to and Western science itself is beginning to validate much of what indigenous people have always been saying about how you work and how the world works. You know, how the world actually works, so that there's a convergence of indigenous thought and also you know, Western science thinking, you know, in some very interesting kinds of ways and some very interesting kinds of parallels. So I think, you know, we have a lot to learn. And for indigenous people themselves, they have a lot to learn about their own histories, particularly. And that's really one of the reasons I wrote the book. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I realized that many indigenous people didn't really understand or know their own histories and how deep those histories go. And so the first step is really to know where you've come from. You know, this goes back to the metaphor of look to the mountain, where you've come from. And then the next step is to know realistically where you are at. You know your present time and have a vision of where you can go in the future. And so that's the message of Look to the Mountain, essentially, in terms of describing what indigenous education is and its potential for indigenous people. Now, for non-indigenous people, it really has another message as well. It's really saying, look at this tradition, look at these traditions of indigenous people, and begin to understand them with respect, responsibility, resonance, and relationship. Because ultimately we're all indigenous at some time in our life and culture. Even the West, the cultures of the West, you know, are indigenous at a certain point in their history.
We're all in this together, finally.
Yeah, and we're ultimately all in it. We're all kernels in the same basket, I'd say.
What a good phrase.
Where it comes to global warming and also the global environmental crisis. So we better start to learn how to work with each other,
which leads to one
creative ways.
Yeah, which leads to one question, and I think got two more. One of them is how do you go about letting go of that dream of control? It seems to me that's been almost like the chimera we've been chasing for a couple of centuries. And it's not going to be easy, I think, to accept that we really are not in control, you know?
Well, I think, that's a good question, but I think that may be another reason I wrote the book. I think you have to begin a process of re-education oneself. It begins within how you go about dealing with each other and dealing with the natural world. And it has to do with relearning some very, very ancient, very old, very human kinds of understandings that we've forgotten. And it is going to take time, and it is going to take some generations to, even for Indigenous people to reclaim some parts of their Indigenous culture in the face of modernization. It's going to take some real reflection. And I think that education is the key. Education has also been the problem. And we have to, in a sense, reimagine education in a whole different kind of way, and in many ways replicate what we once did in an Indigenous historical sense, but we have to contemporize it in a way that works today and has meaning for us today.
I love that sort of sense of learning as being just an integral part of what you do, that you don't have a separate school,
Right.
You don't have a separate program. You go on living your life with the people that
Right.
you care about,
Right.
and that's how you learn. It's
Right.
a wonderful image, isn't it? It's a wonderful
Right.
future. My last one was, your interests are very broad. You have science, education, culture, philosophy. You're also an artist in several media,
Yeah.
and you're also a holistic health practitioner.
Tried to be.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of the polar opposite of a specialist, right? You're
Yeah.
nothing like a reductionist here.
No.
Do you experience that as a life that pulls you into pieces, or do you experience that as a life that somehow you've managed to integrate?
For me, it integrates. I think that I purposely, when I started to when I was in courses in biology, for example, leading to my degree in biology, I was very critical. I was critically analyzing how I was being taught, as I was being taught, and also comparing that with my own traditions and history, and I realized that that the way science was being taught was not the way I would want to do science, and I realized that if I was going to continue in that trajectory of getting a master's and a PhD in science, that I had to give up some things that I didn't want to give up. So I made the decision that I would rather be a generalist in terms of, because I had these other interests, multiple interests, and that the best way I could express that in a profession would be to go into education. And because I saw a much broader possibility, a much broader platelet in the field of education than I saw in the practice of science, because it was so reductionistic. Yeah, but the fact is, the human survival, and you find that in any indigenous society in the earlier times and even to the present day, the most successful people are generalists. They're people who know how to do many things, not just one thing, but many things, and who learn how to do those many things well. And so that insight then helped me to think about, okay, how can I take that idea, which is a part of indigenous understanding of what the learning process is, and make it work for me in a contemporary setting. So it was a creative kind of exploration of ways to apply to become a generalist and yet make a living. And so I found that teaching was the best way to do that in that time. And I think it still is. Yeah.
And ultimately, you did wind up with a PhD.
Yeah.
As it
Yeah.
turns out,
Yeah.
by a roundabout route.
In a roundabout way. Yeah. Very roundabout. Yeah.
This is terrific. This has been such a rewarding conversation. I really appreciate your taking the
You're
time.
certainly
to do it.
welcome. You're certainly welcome.
Just
Well, thank you. And I guess I would say one more thing in contexting all that I've said is that there's one key metaphor that sort of integrates indigenous thinking wherever you find it in the world. And that's that indigenous education, particularly, operates from the principle of life-sustaining for life's sake. And so you can go anywhere in the world and among Indigenous people and ask them what's the essence of what you do and why you do it, you know, as a process. And invariably, in some metaphoric or direct way, they'll say it's for life's sake. And so that single idea, I think, is what they call a menome, the virus that has allowed us to survive, you know, as a human species, is because our societies were created around the metaphor of life, and perpetuating life, you know, became the real ethic. So if we have to find anything that is going to guide us in the future, we have to begin to take a look very deeply at that ethic of for life's sake. And so in my language we say biwo nini, be with life. And so thank you for that, and be with life.
Thank you. Thank you. If you enjoyed this interview with Greg Cajete, you may also want to look at our interviews with other innovative educators, notably Bunker Roy, director of Barefoot College in India, and Satish Kumar, director of Schumacher College in England. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.